So it's now time to get started with our first presentation, which is going to be on vaping prevention. And this session will include vaping mythbusters, prevention, medical treatment, an introduction to Ohio AAP resources, and much more. And it's now my pleasure to turn it over to my fellow Ohio AAP Board of Directors member, Dr. Michelle Dritz, and she will introduce her team. Michelle?
Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can hear and see me. I'm going to introduce just really quickly all the people that are going to be involved in this morning's vaping presentation, because it's really much more than just one person involved. We have many teen experts with us today, pharmacists, as well as those who work in the juvenile justice realm. So I'm going to give a little bit of overview of who they are, and then over the course of the next few hours, you're going to hear presentations and hopefully some interaction with all of us as we talk about and tackle, hopefully, the issue of adolescent vaping. So if you can do the next slide, please. I want to introduce for everyone one more slide. There we go. Okay, there's our pictures of all of our panelists today. We have our three teen experts, Madeline and Ivy Smith, who are part of the Ohio 4-H Healthy Living Advocacy Program. They help create and present programs actually across the nation. They've even presented in DC around the opiate crisis, mental health, and teen vaping. And the Ohio 4-H Healthy Living Advocates really use the power of peer-to-peer prevention to make positive changes in their communities. And they both have a passion for promoting the 4-H, the fourth H of 4-H, health, in their community. Abigail Hockstock is also one of our teen experts. She's a junior at Little Miami High School who believes it's important for teens to work with decision makers about all the issues that impact young people, including adolescent vaping. And she's a first-year member of the Youth Council with the Ohio Youth-Led Prevention Network. A little later on in the morning, you're going to hear from Jengis Whitner, who's a clinical care pharmacist with Primary One Health in Columbus, Ohio. He's done training both at the University of Toledo and Ohio State University, for those of you who cheer for them. And he'll be talking a lot about medical treatment for nicotine addiction. And then last but not least is Dominique Gambrel, who currently works at the Cuyahoga County Juvenile Court in the probation department. She started out as a juvenile probation officer and now currently serves as their systems planning coordinator manager for the probation department. She really enjoys especially the aspect that allows her to work with families and help them with new interventions to support and help that family unit become stronger and more empowered. So with that, I'm going to get us rolling because we have a lot to cover today. And if we can go to the slide just before this, because just a little bit before it, because I just want to give you guys a sense of what we're going to cover today. Because like I said, we're going to bounce from a few different presenters. Abigail, Maddie, and Ivy are going to start us off with some myths versus facts pop quiz. So be ready to do your online polls as we do that. Then we're going to cover some Vaping 101 topics and then move into some more specific information about prevention and supporting healthy habits, both from the medical community and for our larger general community and all those who work with adults. And we're going to talk about medical treatment options with Jengis, and Dominique is going to finish us out with talking about some of the partnering for prevention experiences in the juvenile justice world. So with that, I'm going to have you move forward to the myths versus facts pop quiz, and I'll hand it off to our teen experts.
Hi everyone, my name is Madeline.
My name's Ivy.
And we are sorry about the lack of background. Our computer was not working well this morning. But we are going to, with the help of Abigail, lead you through some myths and facts about teen vaping.
Good morning, I'm Abigail. I also could not get the background to work.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to start us off. So for this one, vape clouds are just water vapor, right? All right. It looks like you guys, most of you got that right. If we can hit the next slide, we have some explanation. Vape clouds actually involve a lot of chemicals, nicotine, and because of how new vaping is, we don't have a lot of research on the effects of secondhand vape. So they are very dangerous, and it is not just water vapor.
All right, so popcorn lung is a condition caused by eating too much popcorn. All right, so yes, obviously that one is false. So if you want to move to the next slide there. Popcorn lung is a condition caused by inhaling diacetyl, a chemical used in vape flavoring.
That's one of our favorite myths and facts on these slides.
Youth vaping is considered to be an epidemic. All right, it looks like most of those are right. In December of 2019, during a press conference, the Surgeon General, Jerome M. Adams, he declared e-cigarette use a youth epidemic.
So the next one is teens who consistently vape won't need higher doses of nicotine to get the same effect. You guys think that is true or false? Man, you guys are great at this game. So teens who consistently vape will develop a higher tolerance to nicotine over time and causing them to need more and more to get the same effect.
All right, so the next one is teens who vape are more likely to smoke. Right, so I think we saw that in that video we watched a couple minutes ago. Teens who vape are up to 4 times more likely to start smoking.
The majority of those who vape are adults, mainly former smokers. This is a myth. 1 in 5 teens say that they have vaped, so teens are vaping more than adults.
Right, marijuana wax can be used in most vape pens. True or false? You guys are right. That is true. Marijuana wax can be used in most vape pens. The difference is that when marijuana wax is burned, it does not emit a smoke or vapor, making it very easy for kids to hide what they're doing.
All right, the next one is marijuana wax is incredibly difficult to extract and therefore harder to come by. All right, so it's a myth. So there are YouTube videos teaching teens to extract their own marijuana wax at home. The process of extracting the wax is dangerous and has led to explosions that have demolished homes.
Those videos are terrible, and there's ones that like teach you how to do it with like a flat iron. So
E-volley is a form of the flu virus. All right. This one is false. False. It actually stands for e-cigarette or vaping product use related lung injury.
Across the US, there have only been 64 reported cases of serious lung disease reported to vaping. You guys are so good at this. It's almost 10 times that amount. As of February 11th, 2020, the CDC reports that there has been 2,807 cases of serious illnesses and 64 deaths across the US that have been linked to vaping. That is a crazy statistic from when we started doing these myths versus facts.
All right, the next one is only those vaping THC products are at risk for a volley. All right, so that's a myth. Although 82% of EVOLI patients reported using some THC products, 14% reported exclusively using nicotine.
Okay, Puff Bars are the newest candy bar on the market.
Okay.
That's actually a myth. Puff Bars are a new e-cigarette device designed for one-time use. They're not subject to the new federal policy that regulates flavored e-cigarettes because they're disposable.
Always a loophole, right? There's always something new.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you all for playing with us. We hope you learned something. And now please enjoy Vaping 101.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Abigail and Madeline and Ivy. So that hopefully sets the tone a little bit in terms of what we're going to be talking about for the next sort of portion, and that is just what are e-cigarettes and vaping, the sort of ever moving and evolving sort of landscape of vaping, especially for our adolescents. So we're going to talk about Vaping 101. Next slide, please. We're going to start by talking a little bit about the numbers and then some vaping information in general and JUULing in particular. And we'll even talk a little bit about those puff bars that they discussed today. I really want to make sure that we're focusing in on nicotine and that risks specifically around nicotine, both physiologic risks as well as for the developing brain, a few additional points, and then we're going to kind of move on into our prevention component too. So next slide, please. I have nothing to disclose. Another slide, please. So here's some of the numbers. Go ahead, next slide. So unfortunately, what we've seen, and these numbers are even from 2018, and it is a forever evolving picture, but we've seen a dramatic increase in tobacco product use in many different forms of tobacco, but in particular, vaping. So if you go to the next slide, you'll start to see that even though in general, over the decades, we've seen traditional cigarette smoking decline very nicely over time, the vast majority of the increase in tobacco product use these days in our adolescent population definitely comes in the form of e-cigarettes and vaping. And if you go to the next slide, that unfortunately, as you'll notice, is a trend that is now reversing for the first time in quite a few years, the overall downward trend of nicotine use in our adolescent population. Again, squarely being caused by the increased use of vaping and the various type of vaping products that we see now available for adolescents. Next slide, please. And you know, it's important for us to also keep in mind for any adult that's working with adolescents that oftentimes, not just with nicotine and cigarettes, but for any sort of substance use, oftentimes we'll see trends of use go hand in hand, but in the opposite direction of their perceived risks. So as things feel less risky to adolescents, their use tends to go up. And we've seen that, for instance, with cigarette use in the past, at least traditional cigarettes. We've seen that with marijuana use as well. And the at least hypothesis is that in part what has made vaping such a dramatic increase over the past few years with our adolescents is that the perception for quite some time has been that they're safe and that they're not risky. And so part of any prevention strategy is going to be to really change that mantra so that both adolescents as well as adults, because many adults also have looked at vaping as being, or at least perceived as non-risky, when there is more and more evidence on a regular basis that shows us the opposite is true, and that they are quite risky, if only because of the nicotine and the addictive qualities, but much, much more reasons as well. Next slide, please. And that, like I was mentioning, that perception means a lot. I mean, there are some studies that, this one in particular, that was asking youth about what they use. Do they consider, you know, whatever type of thing that they use tobacco products, and therefore whether or not they considered it a tobacco product oftentimes broke the idea of whether they thought it was risky. And you can see that they often considered themselves using tobacco products when they used the more traditional things like cigarettes and traditional cigarettes, but there were less likely to label themselves as tobacco users. They were more likely to label themselves as non-users when they were using things like e-cigarettes. And that's even when they understood and would otherwise agree with the statement that all tobacco products are harmful. So their use of e-cigarettes and vaping products felt to them like a safe choice. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit more about vaping devices and sort of the evolution and where we are today. So electronic cigarettes go by many different names. You even hear me sort of go back and forth between e-cigarettes and vapes and all sorts of things. You can see just a snapshot of different types of devices. If you go to the next slide, please, you'll see that over the course of time, oh, it looks like we missed one. Go one more slide, please. Okay, there we go. So over the course of time, what we've seen is a sort of evolution of what is the way vaping products have looked. In the beginning, they very much mimicked even the physical look of a cigarette, and they were they were designed to sort of take the place of traditional cigarettes. They very quickly began to morph to what we consider the second generations or third generations and pods systems, where you now have a much more non-traditional appearance and the ability to have refillable cartridges in order to place your nicotine solution in. And even the most current pod systems now, as you can see on the far right, are very untraditional in terms of not looking at all like cigarettes, and really much more like more common devices like USB ports, or things that are actually much more hideable and difficult for anyone to sort of recognize as an e-cigarette itself. And if you click again, please. You'll see that, as our teen experts mentioned, that those puff bars, the disposable forms, are the most sort of next generation of e-cigarettes. JUUL by far is one of the more common, or at least was one of the more common forms of e-cigarettes that was used particularly in the adolescent population, though not uniquely so. And as you can see, is very much like a USB stick in the way that it looks. That sort of yellowish thing up at the top is the cartridge where the nicotine solution sits, and it sort of clicks right into the otherwise what looks like the USB port part, and can be recharged in the same sort of USB sort of look in your computer or otherwise. Though the JUUL device was marketed and said to be basically a pod system that you need to purchase a new pod once you are finished that pod and they're not refillable, as our teen experts mentioned, you can find just about anything you need on YouTube, including videos to show you or show someone how to refill a JUUL pod, even though they're not technically supposed to be refillable with whatever sort of solution, nicotine or otherwise, that you'd want to put in there and heat up and basically vaporize in order to get that nicotine hit or whatever else is in that solution through that vaping pen. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, JUULing is definitely one of the biggest components of the e-cigarette market, or at least was primarily during certainly 2018, 2019. It made up about 75% of the entire e-cigarette market in the US as of October 2018. And all of the JUUL products, all of them contain nicotine, which was one of the many things that I think a lot of adolescents and adults didn't even appreciate. And they contain nicotine in a slightly different way than the nicotine that we think with cigarettes. It's a nicotine salt with basically a solution that it's sort of dissolved in a way called like benzoic acid, and a humectant that gives and releases a higher nicotine concentration per puff. So you're getting more nicotine per inhalation, and it's much less harsher tasting. So especially as you think about brand new smokers, brand new vapors, it doesn't have as much of that sort of just physical dislike taste that would sometimes maybe turn off others to traditional cigarettes. It's designed to deliver its peak nicotine in the first 5 minutes. And as we mentioned before, that nicotine is in all of them, and usually was about 5% nicotine, though there were some lower concentrations that came out later into the market. But each one of those single pods for JUUL would contain the amount of nicotine in a full pack of cigarettes. So about 20 cigarettes worth of nicotine was in one of those single little pod cartridges that you saw with that picture. As the teen experts mentioned, in general, the vaping devices have a much smaller plume and much less of a smell associated with them. So that's one of the other reasons why they've been a lot harder to hide, or a lot easier to hide. And of course, many of you have probably seen all the wonderful ways that one can accessorize and customize their various vaping devices. And they do have the capacity to be refilled with not just nicotine containing solutions, but other solutions, including marijuana or anything else, frankly, that someone's willing to try. The starter kits themselves for the JUULing devices typically run between $20 to $40, and then each of those refillable pods are their own sort of additional cost after that. Next slide, please. There was lots and lots of information and media attention to teen vaping in general and JUULing in particular that led to, luckily, I think a lot of legislative and policy work that helped to reduce the amount of access for especially adolescents in terms of their access to e-cigarettes and JUULing devices, including trying to reduce the flavors, many flavors that were available for the JUUL devices and other pod devices, which were one of the most common reasons why many adolescents were saying that they were often trying those devices. There was a lot of push to decrease some of the very specific flavors that were in JUULing and vaping devices. However, still some of the more common flavors that even adolescents will use, like menthol, were still available and not part of that larger capability or that larger sort of push to reduce devices. I'm going to take myself off of this virtual background only because it doesn't seem to be working well. Sorry, you guys. There we go. If you can go to the next slide, there we go. So now actually what we're seeing is a movement away from JUUL, in part because I think of some of the changes that we've seen with and policies around JUULs, and more towards what we call puff bars, as well as just other lots of copycats of that. Like JUUL, the puff bars all contain nicotine, and in that nicotine salt component, where you have a much higher nicotine per puff, a concentration, and that less harsh tasting. And those puff bars themselves are also about the amount of a single pack of cigarettes, so that 20 cigarettes per amount of nicotine per device. They also are small and USB-like and come in lots of different flavors. And as our teen experts mentioned, the fact that they were disposable were in part why they were able to get around the policies that came out last year around flavoring and just e-cigarette availability. Unlike JUULs, though, they're much less expensive, especially per device. They're sold pre-charged and pre-filled, and they are designed for one-time use. But again, people can be creative, and there are videos that show how those devices themselves can potentially be recharged or be refilled. Next slide, please. Whether we're talking about puff bars or JUULs or many of the other pod systems, they're designed and a lot of marketing goes into making them appeal to their future audience of what are our now current smokers, adolescents. You can see ways that they can be sort of held and hidden from view, in terms of some of them in devices that look like watches and markers and pens, and even albuterol inhalers, hoodies and backpacks, just to name a few. And of course, we're always behind the times as to what's available that we're not even aware of. Next slide, please. And there's a lot of marketing that goes into really trying to just get adolescents to try, because once they're hooked, it's so much easier to keep them there, just like we saw with traditional cigarettes due to the nicotine in them. So we see lots of work by social media influencers, focus on flavors and social media, and even in some cases, attempts by companies that make various e-cigarette products to get access to youth directly in order to sell their products. Next slide, please. The other line, though, I guess, in terms of what makes e-cigarettes, in whatever form we're talking about, dangerous and concerning from a medical and from a standpoint of adults who care for teens and adolescents and young adults, is that they have a lot of components that even we're not completely understanding in terms of what their risks are, though some of these things we do clearly understand the risks, and the risks are significant. So I had noticed one of the questions was about the humectants. Those are the, in part, the solutions that the nicotine salts are in that help reduce loss of moisture. They're often things like propylene glycol or glycerol. They're also what allows the flavorants to be included as well. And they, especially when heated up into through the e-cigarette device in its heating element, can themselves create carcinogens that can be dangerous for whoever's smoking those devices. The flavorings themselves and what's used to create those flavors have a variety of toxicant profiles, many of which we don't know, some of which we do. Again, as our teen experts mentioned with diacetyl and the risk for popcorn lung, as well as some of the aldehydes and acetyls in those solutions that are known to cause lung inflammation and injury. There is risks associated with the particulate matter that basically sort of comes off of that heating element, including metallic particles like tin and nickel and chromium. And again, when we're talking about those elements getting into our lungs, have risks associated with them in terms of injury and long-term risks. And as I mentioned before, though these are often described as safer than traditional cigarettes, it doesn't mean that they're safe, because carcinogens can be created, especially as many of these flavors or humectants are heated up and vaporized and causing known carcinogens, as well as we were mentioning those particulate matters. And then that's not even to mention the psychoactive ingredients that are often found in these various products. So like the nicotine itself, or something else that is sometimes added like marijuana when adolescents or adults dab. So those have their own risks associated with them as well. So many concerns that we have medically, certainly, and long-term health risks for those that use vaping products. Next slide, please. And, you know, just as a shout out, even for those teens or adults that do recognize the risk of nicotine and are specifically trying to choose vaping liquids for their pod systems that have lower potentially nicotine percentages, or even that say 0% nicotine in them, unfortunately, what the research has found is that those labels, not surprisingly so, are not accurate. The vast majority of them are not accurate, and those, they often have much more nicotine. Even those that say 0% nicotine have much more nicotine in them. And again, the nicotine is in part what is the addictive component, which then just has anyone going back for more regardless of the risks. Next slide, please. And that's really what the sinker is, the nicotine, because nicotine is still nicotine. Doesn't matter if it's in a traditional cigarette or a vaping device, and it's addictive. So next slide, please. As we mentioned in the beginning, especially when we saw e-cigarettes hit the market and JUUL in particular really take hold in our adolescent population, the vast majority of adolescents, at least in surveys, didn't even recognize that what they were vaping had nicotine in them. About 63% of JUUL users said that they really didn't even understand, even though they understood nicotine itself is dangerous, they didn't even recognize that the vaping products that they were using had nicotine in them. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, now what we're seeing is even a move away from JUUL and into other types of still nicotine products, just a different name, just a different package, including things like the puff bars. So the Truth Initiative, which is one good resource in general for teens and families, has an adolescent-focused vaping cessation program that's all online, all sort of text-based. And as they've been surveying their own adolescents that have been using their quitting program, they've found a shift over the past 6 months or so of JUUL use going down and use of other sort of disposable products in particular going up, with puff bars making up the vast majority, or almost half of all of the other types of products that are now making up the majority of what adolescents themselves are saying that they're using for their vaping devices. Next slide, please. And then, oh, can we go back really quickly? One more slide back. Sorry, this is not the, so, and I was just going to mention that, you know, now we're also seeing a lot of adolescents recognizing that, yeah, what they are vaping, they do recognize now has nicotine in it, but that in part becomes a little bit of the draw, that buzz feeling that they get, and how many of them are using it as a way to self-medicate or just to feel better in a time when a lot of kids and adolescents are feeling sad. So it's more than just our messaging at this point that there's nicotine in it and nicotine's addictive. We really need to be able to have messaging that also helps us help them break the habit before it even starts. Next slide, please, now. So let's move on to nicotine and talk about the risks of nicotine, both for the body and more uniquely for the developing adolescent brain. So next slide. We mentioned already about how nicotine is a little bit, or at least it's nicotine, the way nicotine is in the vaping device is a little bit different because it's in a nicotine salt sort of solution that is a little less harsh, also allows for sort of a higher concentration per puff. There's also ways that anyone can modify their vaping devices so that that also increases potentially the bioavailability per puff. And there were some conversations in the chat box about, you know, how many puffs in general do you get out and how much nicotine do you get in? Well, that in part depends on sort of how much, how a person is using them in terms of how much they've cranked up that heating element or how deep their inhalations are and things like that. But in general, the amount of nicotine one gets out of their vaping product has to do with the temperature of that heating element or atomizer, how much liquid they're using, the size of the droplets that they're able to create with it, the depth of that puff, the concentration, as we said, with some of those e-liquids that you can purchase, and where that absorption is happening, since some of those larger nicotine droplets are being absorbed in sort of the upper airways versus the smaller droplets getting deeper down into the lungs, into those lower airways. We mentioned, though, in general, the amount of nicotine at least contained within the solution varies a little bit depending on which vape device you're talking about. But if you think of one pack of cigarettes being 1 pack of cigarettes being equal to 20 individual cigarettes, a puff bar is equal to one of those packs. A JUUL pod is equal to one of those packs of cigarettes. The fixed pods or the Soren pods, other sort of bigger, different types of pod systems, some of those are equal to 2 or 3 packs of cigarettes each. Next slide, please. Nicotine, we know from decades of research in nicotine in the traditional cigarettes, has very obvious physical symptoms that people can notice as they're smoking, both at the moment as well as a consequence of smoking, but includes things like, you know, problems with the lungs and bronchospasms, tremors, potential GI symptoms like nausea or dry mouth or heartburn, physical effects on the heart, including a decrease in heart rate or increase in blood pressure or even an increase in heart rate. Central neurological symptoms, including lightheadedness or headache or that buzz feeling that many of our adolescents are talking about. Next slide, please. We also, unfortunately, know that nicotine, especially in large amounts, can be lethal. And now that we're talking about nicotine that's in a liquid form that also can traverse our skin layer, can be quite lethal and dangerous, especially for our very young children that don't realize even what they have and get into some of that liquid, and they don't need to be inhaling it. Even just going through their skin can be lethal and dangerous for them. Next slide, please. And it's dangerous from the very first puff. That primary psychoactive ingredient, as we mentioned with these vaping devices, is nicotine. And that nicotine goes to the brain within 6 seconds after that inhalation and occupies about 50% of the nicotinic receptors in our brain within 1 to 2 puffs. Those smokers, as we mentioned, can also control just how much or how quickly that nicotine surge is happening into their brain. And sometimes that's exactly what they're looking for, that sort of buzz feeling that they're getting as nicotine hits those receptors. Next slide, please. And nicotine is one of the most addictive substances around, and it unfortunately can affect us regardless of age in terms of its risk for addiction, whether we're newly vaping as an adolescent or someone who is an adult and vaping or using traditional cigarettes. Next slide, please. In part, it's addictive because the nicotine imitates the effect of acetylcholine at the receptors that are literally at the cell level of our brain. And once that nicotine binds those receptors on those brain cells or neurons, it causes a dopamine release that specifically in a portion of our brain called the limbic system that is also seen to be important in the sort of reward circuitry and addiction of many other substances as well, that helps and creates that sort of environment that makes people need to go back for more and more. Next slide, please. Nicotine or addiction in general, but even as we think about nicotine addiction, manifests often in many different ways, both in terms of the physical properties that make it feel like for a person that addiction needs, as tolerance begins to develop and someone needs to go back for more and more in order to keep that same level of good euphoria feeling that they get from the nicotine. And on the opposite extreme, when they try to stop or go longer periods of time without using, they can get withdrawal symptoms, which again just sort of perpetuates that need to continue to redose to prevent those symptoms, either consciously or subconsciously. There's also an emotional component to addiction, especially with nicotine, as it gives that sort of sense of a hit in euphoria and well-being, and for some may have some benefits, at least from their perspective with mood, and therefore in part the reasons why they're using, especially if we're not helping them give other healthier options to be able to help address some of those underlying mood issues. It also can stimulate memory and alertness to some extent. So people may use it again for those effects, which again sort of helps create that sort of emotional addictive component. And for some, it can also, nicotine can decrease appetite. And then behaviorally, that addiction continues to be perpetuated because oftentimes, especially for adolescents, but including for adults, it can be reinforced by social cues and habits as they're using with friends or using under certain situations. And so when they're back into those situations, they sort of emotionally and behaviorally connect the need for more nicotine at that point. Next slide, please. And nicotine has some specific concerns when it's found in the brain of adolescents and kids and young adults, basically any of us who are still in that sort of developmental phase of our brain. The adolescent and still developing brain seems to be more sensitive to the addictive properties of nicotine. There, we see dependence at a lower level of nicotine use in the still developing brain of adolescents and young adults, since that brain development doesn't finish until about 25. And at the most susceptible levels, we can see dependence of nicotine within 1 to 2 days of first use. We also, in that developing brain, can see higher risk for withdrawal symptoms with lower use of nicotine. And again, in the most susceptible of those, we can see withdrawal symptoms happening before someone even reaches a level of what would be equivalent to 2 cigarettes a day. And remember, when we are talking about JUULs or those puff bars, that's equal to 20 cigarettes. So that is not even a JUUL pod or a puff bar a day. That's a much lower amount than that. Next slide, please. And again, as we sort of dive down into the brain at the cell-to-cell level, what we also notice in terms of nicotine's effect on that developing brain is how it seems to modulate what's happening at that brain receptor level, not just at the immediate time of use, but long-term effects of how many receptors or how well that communication is happening at the brain cell level, so that there are longer lasting effects on those nicotinic acetylcholine receptors in terms of their affinity for binding and function related to adolescence, and a much more sort of increased level of sensitivity for those receptors such that they can create long-term effects for adolescent brain development, and a greater positive nicotine effect with fewer negative nicotine effects that just perpetuates that risk for addiction when it started during these adolescent still developing brain years. Next slide, please. And just as a reminder, and we're going to talk a little bit more about adolescent brain development a little bit later on, but that brain development that's happening during the adolescent years, in part what's still under development is that frontal portion, that prefrontal cortex, where a lot of executive function and attention performance occurs, and is really vulnerable still to that imbalance of the addictive properties of nicotine, a little bit more developed limbic system that helps to sort of stimulate the emotional response that can go along with nicotine, but the lack of still fully formed executive function that makes it maybe for some a little easier to say no, but a little harder for adolescents. And as I said, clinically relevant for our adolescent populations, because the use of nicotine during this really crucial time of development for the brain, we can see leads to issues with increased cognitive impairment, particularly later in life when nicotine is started during these adolescent years, an increased risk for developing some psychiatric disorders, and an increase in attention deficit issues, again, that increase with years of use. So next slide, please. And, last thing that I'll say about this portion is that was certainly a big push in the beginning to use vaping as a way to help reduce nicotine use, especially, or at least the way it was framed, for our adult population that were already addicted to nicotine through traditional cigarettes. And what we found, unfortunately, is a little bit more of a situation that looks like a bait and switch, in the sense that in some of the studies that have looked at the potential effect of trying to use vaping as a way to reduce traditional cigarette smoking and to help smokers that were ready to quit. Though we did see some reduction in traditional cigarette smoking for these adult patients that were ready to quit. The vast majority of those that use vaping devices as their mode of trying to quit still required that e-cigarette. So they just basically switched to e-cigarettes. Up to 80% were still using e-cigarettes a year later, versus those that use some of the other more traditional nicotine replacement options that Jangis will talk about later with our medical treatment options. Only 9% of those adult patients were still needing to use some sort of nicotine replacement. So not effective in terms of the ability to get off of nicotine, certainly compared to some of the other options like nicotine replacement therapy. Next slide, please. So the last few things I'm going to talk about here are some other risks associated with vaping beyond nicotine itself. So many of you remember the many cases of EVALI or e-cigarette or vaping product use associated lung injury that really peaked last fall, that caused a rash of significant lung injury and hospitalizations and death across the US. As of February 18th, as our teen experts mentioned, there have been close to 3,000 cases of injury found and 68 deaths, with almost half of those cases being in adolescents or young adults. The vast majority of cases were found to be associated, or at least those patients were known to be smoking THC or marijuana in those vape devices, but not all of them. And about 10% were only nicotine products that were being used, but otherwise met criteria for EVALI. What the sort of current consensus is of right now is that many of those EVALI cases seem to be related to vitamin E and how vitamin E was used basically to cut the solutions that were often THC-based solutions that people were using in those vaping products. But like I said, not all of them were THC associated cases. And yet another example of how what is otherwise a natural product or otherwise a substance or supplement that can be used safely in certain conditions, when you put them in the context of liquid form in a vaping device that is heated up and that is inhaled into the lungs, can have significant morbidity and mortality for anyone using. Next slide, please. Now we're in the midst of a pandemic around COVID-19. And we're also, again, seeing this link between vaping and smoking and additional risk for the coronavirus related to those that do vape and smoke, especially when we think about our youth patients. Youth who smoke were 5 times more likely to describe that COVID-19 symptoms, especially if they vaped and smoked in the past month, and were more likely to be diagnosed with COVID-19. 5 times more likely if they ever vaped at any point, 7 times more likely if they had ever vaped or ever used traditional cigarettes, and almost 7 times more likely if they had vaped and smoked in the past month. And if you hit the cursor one more time, there's going to be something that pops up here, because what we're seeing here is that for especially our youth and young adult population, vaping and smoking is one of the few and most important modifiable risks that many of our adolescents have in terms of reducing their risks for COVID-19. Next slide, please. Next slide. And then, as our teen experts mentioned as well, nicotine's not the only thing that youth can put or adults can put into their vaping devices, and cannabis can be added as well, and that's what we typically refer to as dabbing. Again, oftentimes discussed as if it's a safer way to be smoking, and certainly is not. But when especially we use cannabis products in our vape devices and do that sort of vaporized cannabis concentrate, what we're seeing is that those people who use that have much more potent effects of cannabis because of those very concentrated extracts that are being used in the vaping devices, what we call resins. They go by lots of different names, as you can see there over on the side. And those resins or those concentrates have significantly higher THC concentrations than even what we think about with traditional smoking of marijuana, or even sort of older generations of marijuana in the past. In some cases, up to 80 to 90% THC concentrations in those dab products. We can see again that the adolescent and still developing brain is particularly at risk for the effects of marijuana, just like we saw with nicotine, where we can see changes in gray and white matter and changes in neuronal activity and function, just to name a few, as well as risks associated around attention and memory deficit and psychosis and mood symptoms that we can see for patients, for people who use, including adolescents, cannabis in their vaping products. And those are sometimes long-term consequences. In some of the larger studies, even outside of the US, those who used marijuana products, not even necessarily just in vaping products, but vaping allowing someone to get a much higher concentration and hit of the cannabis, had a lower likelihood for college degree and higher likelihood for unemployment and social services dependence, and basically long-term risks far beyond the time when they may even be using marijuana or vaping THC. Next slide, please. And as was mentioned before, what we see vaping unfortunately being is a gateway sometimes to other substances, or at least simultaneous substance use as well. As was mentioned already, what we see with adolescents who start vaping is that they're 4 times more likely to move on to those traditional cigarettes that even many adolescents agree and recognize as particularly dangerous. And adolescents who vape were more likely to move on to marijuana or binge drink and alcohol and other illicit drugs. And in part, we feel like sometime, or for some components, sometimes the reason for this sort of gateway phenomenon that we can see with vaping has to do with, for some of our youth, what puts them at risk for vaping to begin with may be some of the same predisposing characteristics that put them at risk for use of other substances. Things like using some of these substances to help treat untreated mood disorders or impulsivity issues or ADHD or things like that. And then not to forget sometimes the real psychosocial stressors that our adolescents may be going through, including adverse childhood experiences and stressors that put them at risk for seeking any way to help treat those underlying issues. But in addition to that, we see biological evidence that nicotine seems to have a priming effect on the brain that potentiates that sort of feel and need of even subsequent other substance uses. So not only is there that potentiating for more nicotine, but potentiating when and if they use other substances as well that put them at larger risk for addiction with other substances too. So next slide, please. Last, I think, but not least, is that, again, many of these vaping products have been marketed as, and I think a lot of people have often thought of them as safer, not just safer for the person using them, but safer for everyone around them. And that's not true either. Because even though they may be different than traditional cigarettes, we still see bystanders being exposed to some of that same exhaled aerosol, and with it, measurable nicotine levels, measurable aluminum, and some of those carcinogens that we've mentioned as well before. We also see evidence of clinical consequences for bystanders in terms of the risks that we would see also with even traditional cigarettes, especially with pregnancy. So risk for asthma and respiratory symptoms and pregnancy issues. And that perception, as we talked about earlier, even with adolescents, but also with families and adults, is important too, because a lot of families where the adults in the family have switched to vaping still don't even consider that as a risk for those around them, their children and their infants and their kids. But it is a risk, and it's certainly not just water vapor, as our teen experts mentioned. So, being able to be consistent with the message about the risks associated with vaping is just as important as it was when we were being consistent with the risks around traditional cigarettes as well. Next slide, please. So one of the snapshots that I like to sort of keep in mind and focus on is safer still doesn't mean safe. And though they may be, e-cigarettes may be different than traditional cigarettes, it doesn't make them safe. And there's more and more that we're learning on a daily basis as to why they can be very dangerous, not just for those using them, but for those around them, and particularly dangerous for our adolescent population and those still with that important brain development going on. So next slide, please. And I think we're ready to kind of move on to the next. So what do we do now? Next slide, please. This is where we're going to be bringing in Maddie or Madeline and Ivy and Abigail again in just a little bit. But we're going to start this off by talking a little bit more about some prevention strategies, some strategies around supporting healthy habits for our adolescents and young adults. And then sort of midway through here, Madeline and Ivy and Abigail are going to take it over from me again and talk a little bit more about adolescent perspectives and why we see adolescents making the choices that they make around vaping. So next slide, please. We're going to cover a lot of stuff, so I'm going to keep going. Go to the next one, please. As I've kind of already mentioned a little bit, adolescence is a really important, unique stage of development. It's a time of heightened exploration and novelty seeking. That's really important in brain development, really important in sort of that ultimate transition to adulthood. There's rapid growth, not only of the brain and the body, but socially and cognitively. And with that rapid growth comes some risks, but it also comes some real important resiliency skills that get developed during this time. And that skill development is crucial in their overall ability to really successfully transition to the adult world. Fortunately or unfortunately, many of those habits that get formed during these adolescent years also lay the foundation often for adult health. So education and support by us as adults that work with teens every day is really crucial in helping adolescents with this development during this crucial time of life. Next slide, please. There, as I said, lots of development going on during these years, and I don't put up this slide to suggest that that's the actual size of an adolescent brain, but the idea is there's lots of growth, if not physical, like increase in size, just lots of growth in terms of physical and psychological, cognitive and social changes. So next slide, please. The growth in particular and the development in particular that's happening in the brain still for this adolescent time frame is a lot related to what's going on in that frontal lobe. As I mentioned before, that frontal lobe is important for aspects including personality and judgment and problem solving, logic and understanding. It's where a lot of our governing of impulsivity and aggression comes from. And that area of the brain still is undergoing significant changes during adolescence and does not seem to sort of fully develop until about the mid-20s. Next slide, please. In addition to what is still active development in that frontal region, we see still a lot of development going on a little bit deeper inside the brain in areas that we call the temporal lobes, which is much more involved in sort of hearing and understanding, but also memory and emotional regulation. And this is where the amygdala and the hippocampus sit. And it also is maturing during these adolescent years, though it matures a little bit faster than the frontal lobe and tends to reach its maturation around the later teens, so around the 18 to 19-year-old range. Next slide, please. That means, though, that, as we said, there's a lot of development going on during these adolescent years, and that development is not sort of all going on at the same rate. And so that emotional regulation area, that limbic region, is maturing faster than that prefrontal executive function aspect of brain development. And so you can imagine a time during these adolescent years where there's a bit of a mismatch in terms of brain development and basically regulation for adolescents. And especially in emotionally heightened situations, that more mature limbic system will often, not always, but will often win out over that prefrontal control system. Which is especially important and probably relevant to why we see some of the risks that adolescents in particular can be at compared to adults or those that have kind of finished that full maturation process. Next slide, please. That means that for adolescents and teens and young adults to thrive, it means that we as adults in their lives need to help support them. It's really important. Adolescents really require that balance of developmentally appropriate exploration and experience gaining so that they can reach that ultimate goal that they're trying to reach and we're trying to help them reach, and that is successful transition to the adult world, to the independence necessary, to those cognitive tasks necessary as they move into the adult world. But they also need to sort of learn and get a lot of sort of learning during these adolescent years in order to be fully prepared for that transition. It takes experience to train that brain, and it takes support by us to help keep you safe during that learning process. And I often liken this to the way that we think about this much more naturally, maybe with our younger kids. You know, our toddlers, we certainly understand how important it is for them to explore their environment during those years. And we don't keep them in a bubble, but we just create the safeguards around them that help keep them safe during that really important exploration. We put the covers on the outlets, and we put up baby gates around our stairs and places so that they can explore and learn and grow while also staying safe. And that's true of adolescents. It's just different supports that we're giving, and different supports that we're trying to build up, and different protective factors that we're trying to build. And those protective factors in particular come from a lot of you out there in our world that work with youth every day and are really helping create caring adult connections for them, and helping model and teach healthy coping strategies. And us as parents who are trying to use effective parenting strategies, those tempered both with good limit setting, but also great and constant emotional support at the same time, that really help us support our teens most effectively, as well as some of the policies and the physical and emotional supports that we give, things like our Tobacco 21 laws and limiting marketings, and school programs and community programs that help teach and support adolescents during these crucial years. Next slide, please. Because at the end of the day, problem-free, getting through adolescence problem-free is not necessarily fully prepared. So we want to be able to still maintain that balance of recognizing that developmental, appropriate push and pull that happens as adolescents are learning from and maturing and gaining the skills for that ultimate independence, and differentiating between those that are at risk versus those experiencing risk, and keeping them as safe as we can along the way while that maturation is continuing to happen. Next slide, please. So let's talk about this in the context of vaping. Next slide. Because there's many ways, many opportunities that all of us have every day, often in terms of the ways that we're able to engage with youth and adolescents. Whether we work at schools or with sports teams or after school programs or in the clinic or pharmacies, or just with as a parent and with peers and friends of our own children and at home. There's many opportunities for us to talk with youth. And next slide, please. And how we talk with youth, especially about substance use and including vaping and nicotine use, sometimes varies a little bit depending on what sort of environment we tend to interact with youth. But there are definitely many different tools out there. Tools both for the medical community, tools both for the larger community, whether it be school or youth programming or justice community. It gives us sometimes a framework to begin those conversations and a framework in which to be able to have that sort of back and forth with youth in order to help them with those healthier choices that we're ultimately helping and hoping that they'll be able to make. Tools like the craft screening tool, which many of the medical providers may be familiar with, which are screening questions to look specifically around alcohol and drug use, but sometimes vaping can be included in there as well as the BSTAD and S2BI, again, examples of screening tools that can be used to help start those conversations about vaping and substance use. And then models of motivational interviewing and conversations with any patient, whether they be adolescent or adult, for brief counseling and intervention and referral when necessary, when we find someone is struggling with substance use. Same goes for tools that are used in many schools or other youth programs like Life Skills or All Stars, oftentimes curriculum type based tools that have a lot of messaging around education and prevention, and many of the ways in which our health and physical education communities within our schools are embedding these really important topics into their broader curriculum. Next slide, please. Regardless of whatever our setting is or whatever tool or way that we're having these conversations with adolescents, it's important that we ask. And it's important then that we be quiet and listen. And we need to be able to ask questions, and we need to be able to hopefully answer questions that come up for our teens, and to support our youth in learning those skills to be healthy, resilient, and successful. And when we don't have the answers, or when it's something beyond our capability, knowing when we can refer and access important resources for them. Next slide, please. So how do teens vape? I'm going to hand things over now to Abigail and Madeline and Ivy, and we're going to talk a little bit about why do teens vape.
Okay, so once again, my name's Madeline.
And my name's Ivy.
I'm Abigail.
Ivy and I started presenting teen vaping presentations, when was it?
It would have been like September of 2018.
And since then, we've presented to groups all over Ohio and at our National Healthy Living Summit in DC multiple times. And so we've gotten to hear from a lot of teens about why they vape, and also really
Why they've heard people.
why they've heard people vape, and also really get a sense of how best to present to teens and how to get this information across to them. That's what we're going to share with you today. Okay, so first up, you have this slide, and
This
so
poll here.
yeah, a nice little poll. So I want you guys to check why you think teens might be justifying their vaping, or why they do it. So there's a lot of reasons. It's safer than smoking is a big one that we hear a lot, because that is how it's been presented to us for a long time. It's just water vapor. Everyone's doing it. Peer pressure from either friends or family. They can be used to do tricks. I've heard that one before. They will find just about any way to justify it. So here's some of the most popular reasons we hear. And if we can flip to the next slide.
Okay. Thank you. That was painful.
So a big reason that we hear and that I've seen is that we're often still too young to be thinking about long-term consequences, and old enough to believe we know what's best, which is useful because we need to make big decisions at this point in life. We have to think about college, who to date, the kind of friends we have. We have these big life impacts every day, and we need to be able to rely on ourselves, but we still kind of don't think long-term. So the analogy we use all the time is we are still young enough to see the adventure in jumping off a cliff, but not the consequences of the fall. Go ahead and flip to the next slide.
All right, so peer pressure is obviously a large part of what we hear why people do it. They're like, well, I only do it when I'm around my friends. Like, okay, well, I'm glad you're not doing it all the time, but that's still not
helpful.
Okay. And, you know, they're just in those situations and they feel like there's no other way to get out of it other than to just do it. One time we were presenting and somebody said, well, I don't actually do it. I just take it and hold it up to my mouth.
Yeah. So there is a lot of pressure from teens to fit in. And, you know, it's all over social media. They're seeing it constantly. So peer pressure has only been increased as social media has been on the rise. Go ahead and flip to the next slide.
Abigail, did you want to say anything about that?
I was just going to add in that a lot of what we see on social media and a lot of what influences us is when we see people that we look up to, or people who seem to be more experienced or more educated, and we see them doing these things like vaping or using any type of e-cigarette. That's more so what influences teens, because they think that it must be better if somebody else is doing it.
Absolutely. That's a big thing. And the reason why peer-to-peer prevention works so well is that good role models can usually have just as much of an impact as bad role models. That's a really good point. So these are some of the reasons that we see kids talk about all the time. So it's safer than smoking, so at least I'm not doing that. It tastes good. Only do it with my friends. I don't think anything bad could happen to me. It's just water vapor. What are some other good ones? I only hold it up to my mouth. Have you heard any, Abby? Or Abigail, sorry.
Family members doing it and saying, well, it didn't hurt them, so it won't hurt me. I think we already kind of touched on that. I think it's mostly, a lot of it is the social pressure of, other people are doing it.
Yeah. I think it's safer than smoking. At least I'm not doing that a lot of the times that they're like, well, it's fine because I could be doing something worse.
Mm-hmm. Or it's not going to hurt anyone around me. I'm just hurting myself.
Which I think goes back to what we said about it's not just water vapor. There's a lot of misinformation about that. So when you assume that it's safer than smoking, do you know that it's not just water vapor?
Exactly.
And then like the ones that they can fill themselves or they refill themselves, they're like, well, I
know what's in it. Like, I did it. I'm like, but do you? And should you have done that? Ugh. It's always interesting to hear how people defend it. Because usually it just comes from a place of not knowing all the facts. And that's a big help.
Yeah. We try to help give them the facts. So
arm them with the facts.
And the other thing is when teens see inaccurate facts or like on social media, like we were talking about, if they see an inaccurate fact, but it makes sense to them or it's something that they want to agree with, they're going to be more likely to believe this because it's what they want to believe. So it's important that what we're spreading is accurate information and not inaccurate information.
Yeah, that's very true. I think sometimes it's referred to as like researcher's bias, where you only look at what you want to see in order to make whatever you want to believe seem accurate.
Yes.
And it's definitely with teens a big confirmation bias. Thank you, Teresa. Okay, so we want to flip to the next slide. So what works? How to reach teens? How to get their attention? Like I said, we've talked to a lot of teens, and we are teens, so we know how to hold our attention span. Teresa said that is alive and well as far as confirmation bias. That is a very dangerous thing. So go ahead and flip to the next slide.
All right, so in 4-H, we believe very strongly in peer-to-peer prevention. So teens don't want to be told what to do. Nobody wants to be told what to do. My 4 and 2-year-old siblings, they don't
want to be told what to do. They don't want to be told when to put their socks on. And teens, sadly, we don't lose that as we get older.
In fact, I think it gets worse to some extent. We believe that we can make those decisions. And when you're using peer-to-peer prevention, and it's another teen, even if they're slightly older or maybe even younger.
Think of this as like a camp counselor. Like if you ever went to summer camp as a kid and you thought your camp counselors were just the coolest and you would totally do what they said. But if your mom told you to take a shower, it was like, oh, Mom, no, like I'm not going to do that. Teens are more likely to listen to people that they really look up to or that they see themselves in. So
they feel like we're trying to help them and not lecturing them.
So if you...
More relatable, I think, for them.
Absolutely.
All right, so you can switch to that next slide now. All right, so this is one of my favorite slides. Teens have a very short attention span. The average 15-year-old's attention span is 8 seconds, and a goldfish has an attention span of 9 seconds. So if a teen is engaged, then they can focus on a task for about 45 minutes. Those first 8 seconds, it is necessary to get their attention and hold on to it, because if you are presenting them something that is maybe a slide with lots of words or charts, they aren't necessarily going to pay attention to that at all. That's just the way that they're...
Even if you have something interesting later on, if you lose them in that first 8 seconds, you're done for. They've already checked out. So having a good way to start your presentation and keeping everything short, sweet, and to the point is the best way to reach teens and keep them engaged in what you're saying.
When we present to other teens, we like to open our presentations with a skit. When we are presenting with our fellow health heroes, we usually have a group of like 10 to 15 health heroes. So we have a good sized group that can put on short little skits and things that really get teens.
Make it funny, make it interesting, keep them involved.
and then they're ready to hear those important facts.
Right. Which is why I also think in those first 8 seconds, it's important not to start with, this is wrong, don't do it. If you're doing it, you're in the wrong. It's important to start with an easier introduction for them to not feel so, how would you say that?
We never want them to feel attacked or
Right.
start to get on the defense. We want to help them and be relatable and feel like we're guiding them.
Yes.
Or even just giving them the resources and not telling them what to do. I think that's something. You want to flip to the next slide.
I think that is the
We
next
touched-
slide. Yeah, the power to choose. So they don't want to be told they can't do something, but if you give them the resources, and these are some really good resources that do that with teens, is showing them the real cost, or my life, my quit, just giving them the consequences so that they can make the decision to stop.
A lot of the times, they don't know what the consequences are or what even they're really doing. So you give them those resources and then allow them to make that decision.
And they're going to be empowered to quit, and they are going to want to do it because they don't feel like some adult is telling them or they're being forced to do something. Go ahead and flip to the next slide. All right.
So thank you again, you guys. I appreciate it. I'm going to take it from here. And now we want to take all of that great information that Abigail and Ivy and Madeline were able to kind of clue us in on, because as adults, we're usually the one clueless when it comes to what's going on in adolescence. How do we kind of take some of that information and really hopefully create structure for support for our adolescents and youth? So next slide, please. And there's certainly sort of a useful framework for thinking about these conversations. It starts with asking, screening, whether it be in a really formal way or just sort of general questions, but really the idea of screening to assess their risk or use. Intervening in some way, typically beginning with like a brief type of intervention, often motivationally based, awareness raising sort of intervention. As our teen experts mentioned, it's not about lecturing, but it's about really helping to sort of just lay out some important information for our adolescents and youth. And from that point, potentially the need for treatment or referral to that treatment if necessary or or just additional supports to help with hopefully the overall healthy behaviors. Next slide, please. There's lots of different names for that sort of structure that I just mentioned before, but they're all part of the same puzzle, whether we call it change talk or the 5 A's or SBIRT or motivational interviewing or any other of the many names. It's this idea, again, of figuring out if there's something that is going on, that screening and that sort of intervention component that then allows you to sort of know as an adult working with a teen what needs to happen next, what sort of support needs to happen next, what sort of treatment or referrals may be necessary, or what sort of follow-up may be necessary as well, so that we can help them during this phase of trying to establish those healthier habits. Next slide, please. It starts with getting that conversation started. And as our teen experts mentioned, that fostering of a safe place to talk usually starts not with talking about vaping or talking about or telling them why this or that is bad, but really just creating a space where they feel comfortable. In our clinics or in our community organizations, it means creating those adolescent-friendly environments. Specifically in our medical communities, that also means making time for confidential portions of our visits, ideally starting during the early adolescent years. And those conversations are very much start with things about just how life is going, how things at home and school and friends and activities, and really sort of getting a sense of how life is, where their supports are, what the, their resiliency skills are, so that then you're often able to move into conversations where they may be experiencing risks and have a much better handle of how you may be able to help them reach out for some of those resiliency skills that they already have and those supports that they already have to hopefully be able to address that underlying risk behavior. Same is true though in terms of fostering that safe space for adolescents to be comfortable talking in our community programs. Utilizing those same types of strategies to really allow for conversations, both frank as well as really important discussions with adolescents and teens, and helping them access support services that way. It means building rapport though with our teens, no matter what environment we're having these conversations with them. So as I was mentioning before, in our clinic settings, that means again, we're starting to really focus our conversations, our interactions with our teens directed to the teens, as opposed to our conversations directed to the parent or the guardian. So they become part of being empowered for their own health and their own health care. And similarly for many of our youth programs is building that rapport often is done through the real wonderful mentorship and fostering those social emotional connections and services that are integrated into many of our schools and many of our community organizations and juvenile justice system. And then again, as we're having these conversations, sometimes long before we even bring up the word vaping or smoking, it's about exploring those strengths that the teen themselves has and their goals and their support networks and those skills, so that we understand what matters to them, what motivates them, and where we're gonna be able to help them pull strengths from, especially if there are some risk behaviors like vaping or using some other substance use. And the HEADS exam or the SHADES exam, it's sort of a psychosocial assessment tool that's used by physicians, is a nice sort of strategy in terms of the way to mold those conversations during our confidential one-on-one time with teens in the clinic. But again, even for those outside of the medical clinics, our programs and community organizations have lots of wonderful examples of this as well in the curriculums that they use to really help support and evolve developmental needs and promote skill building for our adolescents and youth. So next slide are some of the examples of just especially some of those school and community and justice curriculums that can be used now specifically around tobacco use and or vaping, like the Catch My Breath curriculum, the tobacco-free toolkit at Stanford University, and they also have one, a marijuana-free toolkit as well. Really wonderful examples of both educational information, resources for adults working with teens, as well as teens themselves and the families as well, that are available to use. Scholastic Books had a curriculum that was geared towards a little bit younger ages than our teens, but again, with very much that idea of primary prevention and hoping of preventing future vaping or nicotine use. Next slide, please. And as always, it always is helpful when we can learn from others. So for many of you who may be coming from the world of school or school administration or just other organizations that need to be thinking about policies around vaping and youth health. Minnesota, Stanford, as I mentioned, Colorado, all of those have really wonderful resources, resources in particular that may be particularly helpful for our adolescent, for our school communities around policies and useful strategies for reducing adolescent vaping and smoking. And one of the ones that I wanted to highlight as well on that Stanford University resources is what is called their Healthy Futures curriculum. So it helps us as adults that are working with teens, and in particular school administrators that are working with teens, to flip the model in terms of punitive ways of dealing with adolescent vaping and really thinking about alternative programming to school suspension while addressing simultaneously the need to really have a strong message to adolescents that are caught or are engaging in vaping or smoking. So a good resource for those who may be looking for more information on that. Next slide, please. We mentioned before that oftentimes these conversations start with asking, and sometimes that asking is done, especially maybe in the medical community, with some of the validated screening tools that can help providers assess a person's use of vaping or other substance uses and how much they may be doing of those particular substances. So the screening to brief intervention tool, CRAFT, I mentioned before, BSTAT, or the brief screener for tobacco and alcohol and other drugs, all are examples of some of the screening tools that have been used in many organizations, and these in particular are all ones that are free to use for providers who find that as a useful avenue to really just begin those conversations and to screen for adolescents and their substance use. Next slide, please. But even more maybe organic than that is just the way in which we as, again, whether we're talking about a medical provider in a clinic or an adult talking with a youth or our own children about vaping, we do find that in general there may be some good strategies as to how we're asking questions that may help be able to smooth that ability for adolescents to be able to talk and to be open about vaping use or cigarette use. So especially for our early adolescent sort of age range or middle school, maybe early high school range, sometimes it's often more useful to start that conversation about their friends, asking about if any of their friends have used or other people that they know. And then sort of moving on to questions, well, about, if their friends have done this or that, have they tried that? Or how was it when their friend maybe asked them to try something? Was that difficult? And have you tried those before? And have you tried stopping before too? And has that part been difficult too? As a way for you to start to be able to really have some open dialogue with our adolescents. For our older adolescents, those maybe in the older ages of high school or post-high school time of working or college or vocational school, sometimes it's a little easier to start those conversations about whether they've ever used or what the circumstances were when they used. Also, though, important to think about what their social networks are using or doing. So if their friends are using, and again, kind of being able to go from there in terms of how it's felt, how those conversations, how those interactions may have gone when they do potentially have other people around them that are using, and how that pressure may feel or how they deal with those social situations that are inevitable in terms of their chance of coming up. Next slide, please. It is, like I said, it's really important for us as adults that work with teens that we ask, but then that we also be quiet and listen and really be able to let them talk and be open about their experiences and their reasons for using. But it's also important that we follow up, sometimes with some really important specific questions, really even just more out of like helping understand what's going on. So asking questions that, even though we may start out with those broader open-ended questions that allow a teen to not just respond yes or no, but to really have a more broader conversation. Sometimes it's important for us to follow up with more kind of closed ended questions that really help us get a sense of what are they using? What types of devices are they using? Are they using flavors? Do they know if it has nicotine in them? Are they specifically trying to use ones that don't have nicotine in them or that have other types of substances in them? Asking questions about when they use, like what are the environment? Is it with friends? When was the last time? How often? Has that changed over time? Have they found that it's been harder for them not to smoke, and so it's evolved over time as well, and even they may be realizing that it's becoming harder and harder to stop. Asking questions about why, what is the environments in which they're using? Is it with friends? Is it social? Is it out of stress or trying to deal with mood symptoms? Is it curiosity? Is it a combination of these things? And then following up with some questions that really, again, kind of delve in to the specifics based upon what they've said so far. So have they tried stopping potentially? What do they feel are the benefits? Why do they use? That gets at the idea of what motivates them, and if as a provider, as an adult that's working with an adolescent, trying to help them with quit vaping or quit smoking, we need to understand why they do it if we're going to be able to help them find other ways in order to deal with that underlying motivation, if we're going to be successful. So if they're struggling with stress, if they're struggling with sleep, if they're struggling with X, Y, and Z, we need to help them find other ways of dealing with that. Otherwise, it's going to be really hard for them to want to give up or to even be able to stop their vaping habits. So really having some conversations about these sort of unique aspects as to why any particular adolescent is using and what experience they've had so far. Next slide, please. And that goal of, again, wherever our conversations are happening, the goal of that conversation should really be around understanding their use, understanding their motivation, building on their knowledge, their own knowledge, to support those informed decisions, and understanding and fostering their readiness for change, because sometimes our goal with those conversations isn't necessarily because they're ready to quit tomorrow, but because we're helping move them through those stages of readiness so they're that much closer to being able to quit or cut down later. Next slide, please. So those stages of readiness, again, many of you may be familiar with this already, but it really starts with, that pre-contemplation stage of, I don't even have a problem. There's no issue at all with me vaping, or fill in the blank, whatever the behavior change may be, all the way to understanding that it may be a problem, but not really ready to do anything about it, to at the very final stage of sort of action and maintenance, being ready to make a change and ready today. And what can I do to help support that really healthy behavior change? So next slide, please. There are lots of ways in which we sometimes can foster these sorts of change talk conversations. Many of you may be familiar with these change talk tools like PACE or OARS. They're really just mnemonic ways for us as adults to think about, you know, how do we help teens really think about what they're doing, to really think about the sort of the issues or their own ambivalence that they may be having about the behaviors that they're having, what their motivations are. They're sort of showing that you're listening and that you're working together as a team towards helping to address those issues, and really using them as the ultimate decider of where do we go from here. Based upon what you're telling me, it sounds like you're ready to do X, Y, and Z. Okay, how can we help you with that? Or it sounds like you're not ready to do this. What do you feel like you're ready to do? Or what may feel like something that you want to change, even if it's not what I feel at that moment would be the most ideal thing to change. Next slide, please. But we do want to make sure that during those conversations, we're showing and giving as much support for those positive behavior changes as possible. And as much along the way, trying to minimize harm during those times as well, recognizing that those stages of readiness for any of us, regardless whether we're an adolescent or an adult, can be difficult and can take time. So they're an evolution that happens, and our job as adults who are there to support teens is to help them during that evolution process, because again, ultimately we're trying to help them with that sort of independence and eventual transition to adulthood. Next slide, please. So we want to be patient directed. We want to reduce harm anywhere that we can, talk about how they can reduce their own nicotine, maybe percentage in there, or ways that can reduce the harm that they may be occurring during those behaviors, even if they're not ready to stop those behaviors. And realize that even the little small steps count, especially because they often build what we call self-efficacy, or that patient's or that person's own confidence in their ability to set an even bigger goal and to move further and further along in that readiness to change. Next slide, please. Again, the way we have these conversations may look a little bit different, whether we're talking about being in a clinic where we're one-on-one with a patient versus in a community organization where we're doing programming with lots of youth together. But there's lots of opportunities for us to engage in these conversations to create a really supportive, safe environment for teens to feel comfortable engaging these conversations. And to really support that broader skill development that help give them resiliency skills, to really bolster those resiliency skills and supports that they're already developing, as we help them really develop the healthy habits that are important, not just now in their adolescent years, but in their adult years as they transition as well. Next slide, please. So many of these resources, many of these things that you're seeing today, including examples like this, are going to be found online with the Ohio AAP, but this is just one example of maybe how, you know, that conversation may look, just to start to put it into like real life terms for an adult working with a teen. But there's no one right way. Like I said, it really comes from a place of really wanting to create a safe environment for an adolescent to talk, and showing them that you're listening and that you're at the end of the day there to help support them. Next slide, please. For those of you who are coming from the medical world, just keep in mind that there are tools or ways that you can bill for some of these services, which is important because they take time, and it makes it hard to have conversations like this in the clinic if you're not necessarily getting reimbursed in a way that lets you create sometimes those longer appointments that may be necessary for your adolescent patients in particular. So there are codes that you can use to show that you've used a validated screening tool for substance use, including vaping. There are codes that you can use to document that you've done some smoking cessation counseling or maybe some more robust expert type of counseling. And you can see what those codes are here as to have for your records. Next slide, please. And as Madeline and Ivy and Abigail were mentioning, there are also lots of resources available for our adolescents directly in terms of helping them quit when they're ready, including resources that are specifically targeted towards adolescents. So the My Life, My Quit is sort of an adolescent version of the Quit line, including here in the state of Ohio. I've mentioned already the Truth Initiative has also a text-based vaping quitting cessation a resource available. And then the federal government also has the smoke-free teen program as well, which also is text-based as well as app-based. Next slide, please. And then lots and lots of more resources. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, but I tried to put them in resources that may be a little bit more relevant for our community and school organizations versus maybe those of you coming from counseling or clinic situations versus parents and families. Next slide, please. And then, as we said before, the Ohio chapter, the American Academy of Pediatrics, also has a lot of all of these resources, including these very specific resources, what we've been calling our RAC cards that have been going over pretty well for a lot of our clinics. So you can download these particular resources. They're small, sort of designed to be able to be about half the size of a piece of paper, front and back. Some that are geared more towards teens as sort of good information to help them make informed decisions about vaping, as well as those geared towards providers with some of those resources and strategies around how to have conversations with adolescents about vaping. Next slide, please. And then, as always, more resources. Sorry, I don't want to inundate you with them, but just know that you'll have these slides that have the links to resources, but also on the Ohio AAP website as well. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm actually going to now hand it over to Jengis Whitner, who I said is our pharmacist, who's going to talk much more in depth about e-cigarette cessation treatment. So Jengis, take it away.
All right, we can advance to the next slide. Thank you, Dr. Dritz. Okay, so before we jump in, I just wanted to give my background with smoking and vaping cessation. So I work as a clinical pharmacist embedded within a community health center in Central Ohio. I do not actually work in a pharmacy. I see patients one-on-one in office to help manage their chronic disease states. And a main focus of ours is smoking cessation. In an initial visit for smoking cessation, I make it clear to patients that we're on the same team and we should work together as such. So the honesty portion from both sides. And for those meetings with patients, I encourage all of our pharmacists and you who are out there talking with patients to not be afraid to ask them to show you their vape pen. Learn about it, listen to them. How they talk about it, what they choose to share about their vape pen is going to tell you a lot about the visit and what to do moving forward. And you want to meet them where they're at. In our visits, we extensively go through the three main challenges that Dr. Dritz alluded to of addiction that make it hard to just quit cold turkey. That's physical addiction, the emotional addiction, how you cope, behavioral and routine habits. We also have a great integrated behavioral health staff within our health center that we collaborate with for in-depth counseling for our patients. So let's move to treatment in adolescents. Really, that's going to be motivational interviewing and CBT. That was covered by Dr. Dritz. The pharmacological treatment or med treatment, there's really limited evidence and data in teens and adolescents. There's some considerations for use in moderate to severe tobacco use or tobacco-dependent adolescents who want to stop smoking. But overall, it's not FDA approved in patients less than 18 years of age. You still need a prescription even for the OTC products for that age. And as always, it's best when combined with cognitive behavioral therapy and counseling. So overall, it's a big risk versus benefits discussion. And today I want to note that although I'm going through the medical treatment options, the majority of adolescents and teens will not need medication therapy to quit per se. So this isn't just oh, someone vapes or smokes and they're a teen, we need to start them on this. This is just the available options if that's decided. Next slide, please. Oh, I have no relevant disclosures. Perfect. So the following slides after this overview slide are going to have a lot of information on them, and they're really meant to be informative. I'm not going to read everything, but since you will be getting a copy of these slides, I wanted to allow you to have the information to be prepared for those details. Next slide, please. I had mentioned that there was some recommendations for consideration in patients or adolescents that are moderate to severely dependent upon tobacco or nicotine. And so there's many different surveys or scales, and this is one of the many, the Fagerstrom scale for nicotine dependence, based on their answers to these particular questions: how soon after awaking, how many overall cigarettes a day, or I guess the equivalent cigarette equivalents per day, and which time of the day would you hate to give up most for your use, and so forth. These are questions that can help you really determine someone's dependence and physical dependence on the nicotine. Next slide, please. All right, so the first one that we're going to talk about today is nicotine replacement therapy, or NRT. So how does it work? It really reduces cravings and withdrawal symptoms by simply replacing the nicotine that's delivered by smoking a cigarette. It's supplied in forms of patches, gum, lozenges, nasal spray, inhalers, but only the patch, gum, and nasal spray have actually been studied in adolescents. You can see that how you take it depends on a variety of factors, like how many cigarette or cigarette equivalents per day someone smokes, or how soon the patient would smoke after waking up. And so how does this translate to vaping? Well, Dr. Dritz's slides showed some conversion dosing based on how much nicotine is contained in different vaping pods and how that would compare to packs of cigarettes. The nicotine in vape pens is a different salt form, as she also alluded to, and it's more concentrated. So maintaining a healthy expectation is very important. With a vape pen, the peak levels in the blood are within minutes, within 5 minutes in some of those vape pens after inhaling. And so if someone's starting on a gum or a lozenge, the peak for those blood levels of nicotine is not until 20 or 30 minutes. So communicating that up front, that it is going to be different, there is a little more time before those peak concentrations happen, is important to say up front, so they're not expecting or don't think that the gum or lozenge doesn't work, and after 5 minutes just start a vape pen or a cigarette again. Additionally, what you would like to remember is that nicotine is a drug. So to give it in the form of replacement therapy like this to a teenager, and let's say using the gum or the lozenge as needed, you want to make sure that the teenager has the maturity level to know how to use it as needed and how much to use. And there is concern for nicotine toxicity and other things if overused, especially in conjunction with the vape pen. So whatever form you choose, you would want to make sure that they have the competency to make those decisions. Next slide, please. So what are the side effects? Overall, they're pretty well tolerated. The patch has some local skin reactions from wherever you apply the patch. You can get some sleep disturbances. And so if vivid dreams or insomnia occurs because of the patch, someone can remove the patch before going to bed. For the gum and the lozenge, most common sore throat or jaw pain. I would say if patients accidentally swallow it before finishing the gum or lozenge, the more common side effect would be nausea. It's like a punching bag in the stomach when that nicotine lozenge or gum is swallowed, because nicotine doesn't absorb well in the stomach. So it's severe nausea at times. Some precautions that you want to look for, of course, there's the precaution because of the non-FDA approval in patients under 18 years old or 18 years of age, and we'll talk about that in a second. People who have had a recent heart attack, abnormal heart rhythms, or worsening chest pain. So that's looking at the concerns for overall nicotine toxicity. Women who are pregnant or breastfeeding is another precaution. If we choose not to do nicotine replacement therapy in this population, we leave it up to the patient who's pregnant or breastfeeding to, either stop cold turkey or continue smoking or vaping. And if they continue smoking or vaping, they will still introduce harmful chemicals beyond just nicotine in their bloodstream. It'll affect the breathing and oxygen levels in the blood. And then also there's an unpredictable or a non-controlled dose of nicotine. So looking at the risk versus benefits in pregnant patients, we have initiated nicotine replacement therapy as providers in replacing fully any vaping or smoking, so that we can control the milligrams of nicotine that's delivered and the doses per day, and we can taper appropriately and get rid of those other harmful ingredients. But again, it's always a risk versus benefit, individualized scenario. If you notice, there isn't anything listed about smoking or vaping while on these nicotine replacement products. There used to be an FDA warning label against any use of smoking or any cigarettes or any vaping, at the same time as these products. But that warning got lifted, and we didn't see the theoretical risks and concerns weren't played out in practice when it happened for the majority of patients if they smoked a little bit while they were using these products as well. And so sometimes that's what we implement in our clinic as well, is using these products to help patients with gradual reduction in their smoking or vaping use that's realistic in the routine for long-lasting success. And then the use in teens, studies have shown that these products are well tolerated in adolescents, but the evidence of whether it's effective is lacking. So it's not currently recommended. However, the benefits of using it could outweigh risk in different certain or individualized scenarios. Next slide, please. This slide is just showing the common products that you may see over the counter. The two on the bottom are available via prescription only. Next slide, please. Another option is bupropion. It's also known as Zyban or Wellbutrin. This medicine works in the brain. It basically helps reduce the urge to smoke and reduces withdrawal symptoms. So dopamine and norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is that adrenaline that we most commonly think of. And dopamine is what releases a pleasurable experience that's critical to the reinforcing effects of nicotine in addiction. And so the drug works on those same pathways to help reduce those withdrawal symptoms and any urges to smoke. It comes in tablets taken once or twice a day, depending on the sustained release or extended release formulation. The biggest two side effects are insomnia and dry mouth. If you have insomnia or trouble sleeping, a patient does, they can take it 8 hours after the second dose, 8 hours after the first dose, so that it's farther away from bedtime. There are some precautions. This drug can lower the seizure threshold, so you want to avoid in people or have caution in people with seizure disorders, eating disorders, and those who recently stopped alcohol or benzodiazepines, which are some anti-anxiety medications. There is a black box warning for children, adolescents, and young adults with increased suicide ideation and behavior. And so medical staff who are pursuing this as an option would want to monitor for those changes in mood and suicidality, and then the parents notified as well to monitor. If significant progress hasn't been made within 7 weeks of this therapy, the chance of succeeding with it is pretty unlikely compared to the studies that are, according to the studies that are out there. So you can consider combining it with nicotine replacement therapy, stopping and using an alternative agent. Those are all viable options. Its use in teens is not officially recommended. There is some data in teens that were at least 14 years old and also at least 90 pounds. There was some short-term success at the 7-week mark for about 104 adolescents who received bupropion, but they received this medicine in conjunction with counseling, which is extremely important to know. Next slide, please. Varenicline, or Chantix. This medication is a partial agonist, is what it's called, at the same receptors in your brain that nicotine, when you smoke a cigarette or vape from the pen, comes into the brain and occupies it. So it prevents that same pathway, and we are to refer to that pathway as a dopamine pathway, the pleasure reward pathway. It prevents stimulation of that pathway, which is associated with the nicotine addiction. So it does stimulate it in some respect, but it's to a much smaller degree than what nicotine would do from a vape pen or a cigarette. And so that's why you have decreased cravings or withdrawals. So for the pharmacy nerds on the call, like me, that would be high affinity or low potency at those receptors in the brain. If we were in person, I normally do an in-person analogy regarding chairs in the room. I'll briefly describe that here, so bear with me. But essentially, if we have a room that's full of chairs that are empty, no one's sitting in them, and then we have some people come in the room to sit down, we could consider those people nicotine that you have after you take a puff from a cigarette or puff from a vape pen. The nicotine comes into the room and takes a seat. Those chairs are the receptors in the brain that I just talked about briefly. And nicotine sits in those chairs, and the chairs are very satisfied. They feel. And so when you introduce Chantix, what Chantix will do is come into that same room and not sit in the chair, but hug the chair from the side. And the chair feels satisfied and feels full, but it's not being sat in. So it's not, there's not as much pressure on the chair. It doesn't stimulate that pathway as much. And then when someone smokes or takes a hit of the vape pen and the nicotine comes in the room, they have less chairs to sit in because some of them are hugged by Chantix. So that's a very simplified example of how it works on those same receptors. And so it's very effective at relieving cravings and withdrawal symptoms because those receptors feel satisfied from being hugged. But it's also effective at blocking the reinforcing effects of smoking because when you do smoke while on Chantix, I've had patients describe it that they just didn't feel anything. It's very good in that respect. It comes in tablets that are taken twice a day, and it's gradually titrated up to minimize side effects. Those side effects that are most common are unusual and vivid dreams or insomnia. If there is insomnia, you could take the dose 8 hours after the first, similar to the bupropion, and be further away from bedtime for that second dose to help prevent those symptoms. Nausea is another common side effect that's really dependent on the dose. And so if there's significant nausea at the highest dose, but not at the middle dose, a lot of times we can get them on a stable dose that's not at the full. And then you'll see a little asterisk next to the neuropsychiatric comment on the slide. And I wanted to touch base briefly on that. There was post-marketing requirements in the United States, which means that after the drug was on the market, there was requirements that the government made for 2 drug manufacturers to investigate the risk of some of those neuropsychiatric behavior changes, irritability, suicide ideation, and so forth. they looked at patients smoking at least 10 cigarettes a day with moderate nicotine dependence who had a variety of psychiatric conditions, but those conditions were stable. So they looked at conditions from 4 different categories: mood, anxiety, psychotic, and borderline personality disorders. This included schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, and bipolar disorder. What they found is that those who were clinically stable in those conditions, there was no notable concerns with, I guess, rocking the boat, or notable concerns in the form of neuropsychiatric effects noted, as long as the patients were clinically stable. And so they defined clinical stability as no exacerbation of their psychiatric condition within 6 months, and also that they were on stable treatment for at least 3 months with no treatment change anticipated during the study. And I think this is important to note because Chantix is one of those medications that usually I have 2 ends of the spectrum that I get from patients when they've heard about it. It's either one end, they heard about it from a friend who did really well on it, they love it, they want to try it, they think it'll work, they don't want to try anything else, that's what they want. Then I have the other end, which is they heard all these horror stories from it, they saw a commercial about it, they XYZ, they read on the internet, and there's usually no in between. And so the US did invest a lot of time into looking into these big concerns of risk, and I think this study showed a lot of promise for us, for patients who are clinically stable, to help kick the smoking habit. If quitting smoking were easy, there'd be no smokers, right? So any help that we can get would be beneficial. There are some precautions as well. This drug can also lower the seizure threshold, can increase the intoxication effects of alcohol, and there's also insufficient data in pregnancy and breastfeeding. And I know I'm talking really fast, but I want to be cognizant of time. So for the use in teens, it's not currently recommended in teens 16 or under. There's some evidence to suggest that there might be some success in teens that are at least 17 years of age. And for those less than 17, though, there was a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, pretty robust in that regard for this trial design. It included 216 teenagers between 12 and 16, and they were taking Chantix. And there was no improvement in the quit, cessation, or abstinence rates for smoking in that population. So for 16 and under, there's really not much evidence there, but there are some studies with promise for those that are above at least 17 years of age or higher. Next slide, please. So these are a resources slide as well. Again, there was more detail on the previous slides than what we went through, and so those are meant to be informative for you and be a resource for you in your pursuit for more information regarding this topic. And that's all I have. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Cengiz. So I know we are running very close to our 1 o'clock time, but we have one more really important speaker, and that is Dominique Gambrell, who's going to talk a little bit about her experience as we partner together for prevention and her experience in the juvenile justice world. So I'm going to pass it on to Dominique.
Thank you, Michelle. Oh, here I am. Okay, so I won't be before everyone long. Just bear with me. Just kind of go over what I do again. I do work here at Cuyahoga County, here at the juvenile court. I'm in probation, one of the probation managers. But one of my other functions here is under the umbrella of Family and Children's First Council. And so I am the juvenile court service coordination liaison here. So I also work with other child serving systems here in the county, such as the Adams Board, Children Family Services, the Board of Developmental Disabilities, all of the school liaisons here throughout the county, Jobs and Family Services, and ODYS. And so what we typically do is when we get pulled into meetings, we kind of work to rep the families with the services and supports they need, see what they have going on already, see what's working, what's not working, and just to make sure that our families are getting supported in the best way that they can so that they can be, become stronger family entities on their own. So typically here at juvenile court, we would not see a lot of kids with just vaping alone. Even with marijuana, those kids we kind of divert to our early intervention and diversion program. Though they get screened out, they get any type of assessments, and we kind of refer those kids out for services. The youth that I work with, since I do work in the probation department, are either on probation, they have cases that are going through the court process to figure out, maybe they're going to be placed on probation, but these kids have official cases. So they are a little more serious than just the typical marijuana use or vaping that we typically deal with. So with those kids, it kind of links into the next slide. We can kind of go to the next slide. So this right here is a study that was done by the University of San Antonio, and it was how vaping is linked to adolescent propensity for delinquent behaviors. So I kind of went through, and these were like the 4 main factors that kind of stood out to me. The first one is that teens that vape have a higher risk of engaging in delinquent activities such as acts of violence and property crimes. So what are acts of violence? Acts of violence would be including fighting at school, gang activity, gang fights, causing injury to someone else, and then also like carrying a weapon. And some property offenses will be stealing, either stealing money, stealing cash, credit cards, or cars. And then also property damage to your house or to your car. So those are some things that teens who vape have a higher risk of doing. Some other things that we thought were important, that I thought that was important in the study, is the ability to conceal illegal substances, and vaping devices can encourage teens to engage in more delinquent behaviors. So that's pretty much where peer pressure comes in. And we kind of talked about peer pressure earlier in the presentation, but once kids, they see that they can get away with things, they want to push the envelope a little more. The parents didn't find them vaping, so what else can they do? Also, the next bullet point was teens who vape marijuana are at a significantly greater risk to commit delinquent activities than youth who ingest marijuana through traditional methods. Mm-hmm. And so that's what we kind of talked about earlier as well, this whole new world with social media, and how it's kind of influencing them as well. And the last bullet point was the strength of the relationship between vaping and delinquency is contingent on what is being vaped. Marijuana vaping being most heavily associated with delinquency. So that kind of proves that, teens go from vaping nicotine, then they kind of move to marijuana, and then they move to branching out to start committing delinquent activities. So I thought this study was pretty cool. It actually was a study of 8th graders and 10th graders. Next slide. Rattling the nest. So I've been at the court for about 8 years now, and a lot of my time here has been working with families, trying to get parents to kind of be more proactive rather, and like searching their kids' room, and because they can control some of what goes on in their home. So just working with various providers and court officials, these are some of the things I've noticed that works to help parents kind of take back control of what's going on and kind of reduce the risk of their kids continuing to vape. So I know it's a lot of professionals on here, but when you're meeting with parents, kind of just go through some of these topics with them to kind of help them understand what they can do to prevent this. So the first one would be increased supervision, and that's just knowing where your kids are. Are they at work when they say they're at work? Who are they with? Are they actually over their friend's house? Just knowing what they're watching on TV, kind of what they're texting. That kind of helps, if the kids kind of know that their parents are monitoring what they're doing, they're being held accountable. Frequent room sweeps. Check the rooms. That's a lot of things we tell our parents here all the time, check under the pillows, check under the mattresses. They hide things in dressers and drawers, and make sure they're random, just do random frequent room sweeps. Backpack checks and laundry checks. Kids typically hide things in dirty clothes because no one wants to check the dirty clothes, right? So dirty clothes, backpacks, the new backpacks now have all these fancy zippers on there. So kind of just go through the backpacks and, you know, just check to see what they have going on there. Peers. So this is a major factor because we need to know who our kids are hanging out with, right? So we kind of tell our parents, you know, instead of just being so willy-nilly letting them kind of go, figure out who those peers are. Are they positive influences on your child? Are they negative influences? You know, what do these peers do? What do the peers like to do? And then the next one would be money, right? So who is providing your teens money to purchase vaping devices, right? And a lot of parents provide it through the way of allowances, right? So I think one of a really creative intervention that I've seen done here is instead of parents giving their kids allowances once they know, you know, if they know they have these certain issues, whether it's vaping or whether it's other drugs, instead of giving them allowances to go, you know, hang out with their friends, they want to go to the movies, get them gift cards. That kind of cuts back on their access to money. Gift cards to restaurants, gift cards to movies. And that's where it comes in. You have to have that relationship with that child as well to kind of know what they want. So I think that's a really cool, creative way to kind of, you know, monitoring what your kids are doing with the money. And then the last one would be just school and family supports. It's really important to kind of let the school be on the same page, especially if you know if parents have some concerns with vaping or marijuana use, to kind of let the school officials know so they're aware of what they're doing. You know, they're aware of who the kids they're hanging out with. They're aware of, you know, that their kids are, you know, sneaking off. So it kind of helps to have everyone on the same page, and that holds the youth more accountable as well. And that's the same with family support. I think a lot of parents try to go through this alone. And I think, you know, it relieves some burdens if they kind of let people in the family know what's going on as well. Let the aunts know, let the other parents know, grandpas, like everyone can kind of be on the same port to also provide different supports for that parent as well. So those are just some of the things that I kind of thought that was pretty helpful on trying to prevent the increased use of vaping. I'm interested to see like if there are any other interventions that you guys have found. I know we're running out of time, but if you found some interventions that was helpful for you guys, it would be kind of great to just see it in the chat box. And then next slide. So these are some of the resources that was put out earlier. I think for Cuyahoga County, most of the resources we have are kind of just limited to our county, but these resources are great. We also have mental health agencies here like the Ohio Guidestone, Applewood, Beechbrook, Belfair. I think it's just important to kind of reach out and kind of search your county to see what resources they have, because that's how we usually do things here. So Michelle, I'm not sure if you wanted to jump back in. That was it for all the slides that I had for juvenile court.
Thank you very much, Dominique. Yes,
You're welcome.
I put in just a few, sort of highlighting again some of the resources we have already talked about, as well as some additional resources. So these are the QUIT resources, as we mentioned before, that are actually targeted for teens and young adults. Next slide will show you some additional resources. If we can get the next slide, please. Some additional resources, again, geared a little bit more towards adolescents, geared a little bit more towards families and parents and guardians. If you go to the next slide, which again, just as a reminder, everyone will be getting all of these slides. But the next one has also some additional resources that are maybe a little bit more specific to the state of Ohio. So hopefully the next slide will come up, but it will show the Ohio Department of Health and some of those peer education opportunities and resources. I saw lots of talk in the chat box about how do I get Madeline and Ivy and Abigail to come talk to our students. So, you know, part of the two organizations that you may want to reach out to specifically for those sorts of peer-to-peer education opportunities are the Ohio 4-H Club, and Teresa Ferrari is part of the 4-H Club that helps with those peer-to-peer peer-to-peer education opportunities, and the Prevention Action Alliance with Evie Roberts there. And I put some contact information as well for both of them as just 2 examples in the state of Ohio. And then last slide, because we are already past our time, everyone, and I apologize for do that, but I really want to thank all of you for participating today, because at the end of the day, it's all of us working together that are going to make the biggest